Welcome to the weekly podcast of First United Methodist Church in Costa Mesa, California. Founded in 1912, the church gathers on Sundays at 10 a.m., and we invite you to join us anytime. For more information, visit our website, costamesafirst.umc.com, or connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter.
Well, we are in the midst of a series called Reformation, a way of looking at our faith again in a new way. And we've been talking about this word deconstruction. And that is why, oh so cleverly, we have these doors. I know what you've all been thinking. How in the heck do you hide a 6'5" worship leader? Well, this is how, friends. These are the old front doors of our church. And we've been using them as an object lesson, and we're going to talk more about that, but I want you to sort of, as I speak, if you ever just sort of need to check them out and notice the differences in them, maybe notice the difference than the doors that you walked through earlier, as we talk about what does it mean to go through Reformation? What does it mean to go through deconstruction? Why are you here? That's my question for today. So let us pray. God, as always, would simply the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts here together in this space be acceptable to you, because God, you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, I'm going to have to backtrack a little bit to explain how the heck we got to this worship series. And I want to make sure that as we enter in this series together, however you are, if you're hopping in online or if you're here in the room and that you're like, I didn't know what we were talking about, I just showed up. So I want to just give us a quick little backtrack to where we've been. But I also want to invite you, this is a 6-part series, and it really isn't one of those ones where you can just sort of only hear one of them. They all go together. Because the truth is, this idea of deconstruction, this idea of sort of what does it mean to take apart our faith and look at it, all the pieces of it. If we talk, even in this room, people are in different stages of that. Some of folks don't even know, like, I've never even heard that word. I don't even know what I would deconstruct. But we've all gone through something in our faith, a shift. Something is different. We mentioned last week that deconstruction is this idea of taking apart things, looking at them and figuring out what they are, what's needed, what's not needed, and then realizing that it's important for us to do that. And in this room, there really are sort of two groups, and some of those groups actually overlap. And so I shared last week that for some people, they grew up going to this church, and it looks so different. Not just the building, but the folks that are in it. There has been a deconstruction of the container that was once First United Methodist Church of Costa Mesa. And in some ways, it's almost gone back to some things, hopefully the helpful things of what was known to be this faith community. For other folks, we hear again and again, like, how did you find this church? And it's like, I heard Sarah talking on some podcast about deconstruction, and I showed up here. Now, what's interesting is when I sit with a lot of people, they talk about this feeling of deconstruction as an intense grief or loss. We talked about that last week because it's helpful for us to remember as we look at this. And I'm using the structure really that I have found helpful is Father Richard Rohr. He's a Franciscan monk. He also sounds like Tim Gunn if anyone listens to Project Runway. So now that I've given you that image, go listen to him on a podcast. I had the honor and privilege of sitting with him as he talked through some of this stuff, and it's really helpful. He has sort of this idea of 2 stages of life, and he's really not the first. If you studied psychology, there's Carl Jung talks a lot about this idea of maturation, but I want us to be careful in the language that we use even in deconstruction, because when we say maturation, it suggests somehow a betterment than you were before. And really, that's still sort of dualistic or first phase faith language. And again, if this is like all kind of sounds vague and out there, I understand, because it's this strange thing, especially if you're sort of in the first stage or if you've gone further along or if you're trying to figure out what the heck this is. But if we have this sense that like there is something shifting within us, within our faith, I want to say that I don't think it's as much of a loss as sometimes we think and feel, and I've been there. In fact, preaching this has been a very personal experience for me, kind of reminding myself of the faith container that I needed to get out of in order even to be in this space with you today. Now, if we talk to people who work with children, I have a couple of friends who are social workers, and we were joking yesterday because my dog was laying on one of my good friends but had to have he had to have his paw on me. Right? And she said, that's secure attachment. And I was like, that's how you know your friend's a social worker. But we talked about this idea of really like kids need a container. I don't think it's an accident that Scripture says that we are almost to have faith like children. We sometimes need the rules. And you know this because you've had a friend. Have you ever had a friend who was like incredibly crazy? I have a sorority sister, but then met Jesus and now is the most conservative version of Christian? Oftentimes, people who create the container later in life need to go back and sort of restructure the thing that makes them feel safe. So we talked about last week these doors almost as an object lesson for the idea of what brought us into church in the first place. And sometimes when we're going through this process of deconstruction, when we're trying to re-envision our life, we talked about Jacob, who will wrestle with God. And wrestling with God is a physical thing. And that was important in Jacob's journey to becoming Israel because Jacob had walked into that cerebrally. Jacob thought he knew who God was and is. For many of us, we have tried to get the right belief. We have walked through these doors because maybe we said a certain prayer that was the right prayer. Any of you who grew up in any way like I did, I moved from Canada, which is considered a post-Christian culture, to Mississippi, and I just kept getting saved. Like it was the thing to do on a Friday night, if I'm honest. Like we would go to like an Avalon concert. If you don't know who that is, YouTube it. It's glorious, white suits like you've never seen before. And every time there would be an altar call, and I would be so afraid that somehow like that week I'd lost my salvation, whatever I even thought that meant, but I would walk down to like reclaim this gift, this prize. I wanted to get back into the box. And if you grew up that way, there were some helpful things, some rules. In fact, even as we look at this beautiful love story in Scripture, we have this idea that the people needed rules. And so there's all these incredible rules that I'm often reminded of the list of rules and how really those who even say I only live by the Bible, most don't live by those rules. It would be really obvious if they did. In fact, I had a good friend who had a tattoo on his back when we were in college. And I remember we were at a baseball game and this man started quoting scriptures to him about his tattoo and like, don't tattoo your body. And he turned around and quoted just a verse. And then he said, nice haircut, and walked away. Because the tattooing verse is right near the don't cut your hair verse. We pick and choose the containers that we keep. And we came to this conversation and this object lesson of the doors that brought us in. Maybe it was the fear of hell. Was that the door that brought you in? Maybe it was actually just like you came in with a friend who happened to like have a faith that you were sort of interested in, right? Maybe you came through the door. There's a member of our community who shared with me, like, after I lost my husband, I just needed friends, and I don't know how you make friends as an adult. So that was what brought her through the door. And now that's beautiful, and the container that we build when we first start out, it's sometimes we're angry about it. And that's okay, that's also helpful. It's almost like a teenager needs to have something to rebel against. But there's also an honest and a truth and a reality that some of the containers that we either put ourselves in or we were put in were not healthy. They were damaging. We hear this word spiritual trauma, and it's a real thing. And I know that because there are people I have sat with, and we have just talked about their faith, and they just burst into tears. And sometimes they don't even know why. But the thing that they grew up with, the faith that they grew up with, so damaging and hurtful that they have no choice but to create a new container. So we get to this story, this idea. The first week we talked about the importance of recognizing both the good and the bad of the container. And if you didn't get a chance to do that, again, however you're going through this series, I would say, go home and think about what are the things you're actually grateful for. I asked my good friend this. I said, as you think about your faith that was really hard, what is the thing that you're grateful for? And I wasn't going to share this with you guys, but it makes me laugh, so I'm going to share it with someone. She said, I'm really glad in some ways, I know the purity culture I grew up in was really damaging, but I'm just really glad I wasn't pregnant before I got married. It's put that on your list. There are things to be grateful for, but it's also the sense maybe that you were loved. For me, moving from another country, I'm grateful for the fact that when I came to a church, I found immediate community and family, and we had shared narrative. I wouldn't have had that. I remember my first day at school. By the way, moving from Canada to Mississippi was an experience. And I moved at a time when you're really secure in yourself. I was in 9th grade. And so and I remember, guys, you can laugh at me. This is the most Canadian thing I'll ever say to you. I wore my favorite hockey jersey my first day of school. And I remember because there was a female who played professional hockey. I don't know if you guys knew that. Played for a California team, Menarion, goalie. You don't need that, but just thought you'd want that. So I was wearing her jersey because it was American, and I thought, here I'm going to be thematic. And I was not at school for longer than an hour before someone said, do you dress like that because you're from Canada? Oh, in 9th grade. But the week before, I'd gone to a youth group. And so I had people to go stand with. And lucky me, I happened to go to the youth group where the cool kids who played football went. So I happened to have the biggest friends on campus. Friends, there are some healthy things, but that doesn't negate that there are harmful and hard things. You don't have to look for the silver lining, but maybe for the gifting, because it's going to help us move into the next stage of life, the next stage of faith. And that's really the invitation, isn't it? To again experience. And sometimes I think we spend so much time sort of trying to patch up what got us here. I find the people who are angriest or most concerned with even my inclusion or whatever it might be that they don't understand about my faith, I find that they are yelling the loudest to make themselves believe what they want and need to believe. Right? There is this sense if we can just patch this up. What's interesting though is once you start looking at the door, you start to see more holes, don't you? That's the way it was for me, by the way, in this. There are literally holes in this door, and we had it as our very front door of the church. And people had done their best in the beginning. They had built this door. It was going to be the thing that kept people in church. But what happens is it would expand and shrink over time. And people kept trying to use this door. And so when I started the sanding process, is what we talked about last week, sort of getting rid of the things that maybe we don't need anymore to sort of get to the raw material or the good stuff. If we're going to admit that there's a difference between deconstruction and demolition, then we're going to admit that we want to build something. Why do I know that? Because you're here, and it's Southern California, and football's on TV. There's lots of other things to do, but you're here. So even if you're not sure, even if it's just I have no idea why I'm here, but you've started the process of trying to get back to the raw. But what I found is I started to sand this, and my friends Anita and Carol, who have, you ever think maybe I'm a little bit like the character who was come paint my fence. Several months ago, I said to Anita and Carol, let's just sand this really small, upstairs. It's just a tiny little room, and you guys could help me redo the floors. 4 days later, we were still on our hands and knees, because the truth is the way that they used to do weatherproofing, when you start to sand it, it starts making these balls, and I didn't learn my lesson the first time, so as I began to work on this, the same thing started to happen. But I felt in it a sense even about faith and Every time we work on things, any of you who have served as pastors, you know you start having like sermon experiences when you're alone doing anything. And I realized like the longer I would be on an area and just try to make it work, it would just gob. But if I would use a light hand, almost a playful hand, and sort of just lightly go over, that's what happened at the bottom. It's like it needed some room. Sometimes when we are in this process of deconstruction, it's okay for us to say, I just can't like focus too much on this area. I need to sort of play around a little bit. And that's difficult. It's difficult to lead a community like this, guys, because it means I am not like, you need to be here every week. No, maybe there is a lightness, but you still need to be in community. So we get to this story, this incredible story in Matthew, and I really want us to notice there's some beautiful hints about what this story is about. As we talk about this call of Matthew, now it's interesting because is this the writer? And if so, why is his call story so far along? But it's because it almost fits in these stories of healing that are before and after it. But here's the story and the call of Matthew. I'm going to read it to you again. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at a tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. That's like, I wish, like, if I was like, hey, you should join my church, and then people come, it always weirds me out. But there is something that we might miss if we only look at this in the language and the translation. We might miss that when he says, and he got up, it's the same language as and he was resurrected, or he experienced new life. Following Jesus for him is going to be a death and resurrection because he is walking away from what he once knew, the tax booth. Now what's interesting is there are these people, these Pharisees, and we always like give Pharisees a bad name, right? Again, I think sometimes like we hate the thing that we see in ourselves the most, right? So as Christians, we're like, those Pharisees, who would ever say you could only use one book and you had to use it right? Us, right? And so there is this sense where the Pharisees are really a storytelling way of us seeing ourselves in the story. So here is Jesus, and he's sort of got this old framework for who is in and who is out. And he's sort of sanding it away and saying like, no, like these are the people that I want to eat a meal with. And also I want us to notice that following him meant going back to his own house and spending time experiencing and giving hospitality. Isn't that interesting? He almost has to go back to where he was from. Sometimes that's what deconstruction looks like, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks, but I want to put a pin in that for us. So here come the Pharisees. They're the ones who notice, hey, this isn't right. They're the rule followers, and we talked about rule followers. I'm one of them. I also happen to have been a youth leader and worked with a lot of nonconformists who love to mess with me as a rule follower. There is a man, he's one of my best friends. His name is Ted. He's in his late 70s. Ted always drives the youth van in the out and out the in. Doesn't matter where we are, because he thinks it's funny to watch me panic. Because I love rules. Because they tell me if I'm good or bad, right? But in this story, there is no sense of mercy or grace. Like, why are you hanging out with these people? And I love the image that Jesus gives them. He says, I want you to notice that I didn't come for those of you who think you are well. You almost need to feel a little bit like there is a reason or a sickness or kind of like a sense. And it's not saying that like all of us are broken, but it's more like I want to be present to those who are aware that there is something that they want to move beyond and through. You guys think you've already got it. And if we talk about this first and second idea of life, first, people who are in that first stage often are just in the thou shalt nots. They're stuck there. And that's good for them. Perhaps that's old wine. And so we have this image of old wineskins. And that's kind of weird for us, isn't it? Like, we don't really have, I was talking to my friend Michael over there, and I was like, what do we have, like, as an example of, like, old wineskins trying to put new wine in, and what happens, it's so stretched, it explodes. Well, wine doesn't stay on our shelf long enough in California for that to happen, but, or maybe that's just my home, but there are things, like, think about the kids who just went back to school last week. Teachers, did you see anyone who was trying to wear the pants from the year before? Right? They grow out of everything so quickly. Or maybe you are like me and you're a hospice caregiver for plants. You know what I discovered? Plants grow out of their pots. That's something I didn't know. That happens. Apparently they need more space. Same with this idea of cloth. If we have a rip in our cloth and we try to put some sort of brand new patch on it, if the patch is of a fabric that will not move, think about this theologically, will not move with the way life is, it causes a rip in both. Now, what's interesting to me here is that Jesus does not say that the old wine is bad or the old coat is bad. He's simply saying we need to sort of figure out how to make sure that we ourselves are not using the wrong container. What's really, really interesting to me, and maybe not to you, but if you're a Bible nerd like I am, the idea of the wineskin and the cloth, if you learn much about the community and culture there, winemaking was considered a male trade, but sewing and cloth, female. So this is an example where, Jesus is using sort of the idea of both gender. Now we would say all genders, right? This inclusiveness is growing. This idea is growing. It's this beautiful moment where Jesus is saying, look. That is how it used to be. But I came here not to get rid of your box, not to destroy the thing that you had. And I want to invite you into something more. I did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. But it may not look like the law that you're used to. And sometimes, friends, when we are in this process of taking off that which we do not need, if you'll notice, the handles and stuff are not on here anymore. Is anyone else excited to know where these are headed? No, just me. Perfect. We're going to be using this wood for some great stuff, but we're not going to destroy it. We're going to repurpose it. Sometimes when we take apart things on our own faith, it can feel like when I remove that, everything goes. I can't tell you the number of times I've sat with people, and it's that moment when they discover that maybe something in the Bible contradicts something else in the Bible, and they look at me like, do I have to throw the whole thing out? And so we sit and talk for a long time. Or maybe they have an experience of someone that they thought like, no, I'm pretty sure this is what the Bible says about this kind of person. And then they meet someone and they're like, wait a minute, that doesn't fit in with who I know God to be. What do I do with this? And so these gaping holes start to happen. And so you start to sort of sand away the things that you thought once mattered so much in your faith. You just thought were so important. And it can feel like a grief, and you can experience homesickness. Have you ever felt that? Homesick for maybe a church community or a faith that you thought you once had. If you haven't experienced that, read a journal from when you were younger. Oh man. Right? We had this certain set of rules or things that started to make sense. So we might be in the midst of this deconstruction. This isn't really that pretty, is it? It's kind of not exactly what we would want it to be. In fact, it's sort of just not done. I want to suggest to you that whatever stage you're in, it's this idea of you're trying to create this new wine, and it can be painful, and you can kind of feel like the grapes being squished into something new, and it's an invitation, and not everyone goes through it. And even those of you who maybe it's that this community of faith has changed, and man, it can feel like that is not what it used to look like, and I'm uncomfortable. Usually this part is uncomfortable. Do you know how I know that? Because I got a sliver when I was trying to do this in my nail. It was the worst. I know. But as I was working on this and thinking through this, I thought about how much more these doors mean to me when I sit and I take the things off that don't exactly work for what we're going to turn them into. I pulled off, by the way, I wish it's good that sometimes my Amy, who's amazing, is here when I'm doing this, because even if she's not here, I talk to myself during this process. My best guy friend happened to be in town, and he was also here in the sanctuary. And I was so proud of myself for figuring out how to pull this door thing, which I probably could have found out on YouTube. But on the bottom of it, it said the piece was built in 1915. This metal piece. I'm like, oh, I can't throw that out. What am I going to do with this? And you start to kind of get creative. Again, it's this playfulness. And I would suggest that it's this idea that Jesus is trying to invite the Pharisees into, trying to invite us into, trying to allow us to sort of become unfamiliar so that we can fall in love again. What is new that can be built in our faith? What do we need to keep? What do we need to get rid of? What are we being invited into? When I was in high school, I was really lucky. We had an AP art program, and so I was part of an AP art program. And I was always trying to do well academically. That was very important in my family, and so very important for me. And I was in this AP art class, and I've shared this story with some of you before, but my teacher called me in one day, which, by the way, I also always have a guilty conscience. So I was like, I don't know what I've done. I start thinking of the things that I possibly could have done. I love it. Some of my friends in the room are like, I would have been like, cool. So I'm walking in, and I'm about to meet with my teacher, and she's this renowned artist. And she said to me, Sarah, you're going to fail this class. What? Is my art not good enough? No, you're a great artist. Well, why am I going to, how? And I start panicking, and I'm thinking about life on the street, because clearly that's all that's left for me. I might jump to conclusions too quickly and have some anxiety. But I was really afraid, what? She said, Sarah, you're not turning in things enough. I said, what do you mean? I said, well, it's not done. She said, Sarah, every artist, everyone when they're creating something goes through a stage when they don't think it looks very good. And real artists are the ones who can push through and just turn it in. Now, I don't know if she was just trying to get my stuff turned in, but that has sat with me for a long time. This idea that we need to push through the things when it doesn't quite look right. And it's not because you have to have a certain faith that looks a certain way, but more because you are here in this space. Clearly, there's something that still holds some mystery for you. Maybe there is an invitation. So what I would like us to do today as the band comes forward, and they're going to play the song again, by the way, from Mumford & Sons, because Quentin hates them. No. Mumford & Sons, because this song is really one that blew my mind away. This idea that he was writing to the former Christian community that he had grown up with. This idea that he wanted to understand what they believed, but he himself had shifted. I think we can relate to that, perhaps. So on this sheet, you'll see there are two sides. So one side has the lines on it. The other side is free space. I want you to use whatever side you want. Ooh, Marty wants a rule. But I want you guys to use whatever side you want. One side, I want you to write the things that you feel like in your faith. Whatever it might be, the door, whatever it is, the things that no longer work. This is just for you. No one else needs to see it. Whatever it might be, maybe it's a rule, or maybe it's this certain thing that I think that I have to do all the time. Whatever it is, put it down. Things that no longer work. And whether you think that's good or bad, make no judgment. Just simply write it down. Or maybe what got you to this place of deconstruction or difference. Now, on the other side, if you're ready, and again, we're all in different places, what are the things that are working? For some, as I was sharing with my group that I meet with to talk about faith and this church, I said, what would you say is working? He's like, I don't know. I keep showing up because there's something about love that I feel in that room that I don't feel anywhere else in the week. And I'm just going to keep showing up and listening to that. That's little. It's great. Whatever it is. Maybe the faith thing that works for you is this is an opportunity for you to experience God in a way that doesn't feel like God's angry at you. Whatever it is, whatever is working in your faith, this is an invitation to put that on that side. So yes, one side, things that aren't working. Other side, things that are working. The band's going to play the Mumford & Sons song and then invite us into the last, and then I'll come back for the benediction. So take this time. It's yours.